All right. It is Friday, March 21, 2025, a few days before a federal election is apparently going to be called in Canada. And one of the issues, if not the issue in this election, is likely going to be Donald Trump's tariffs. And a kind of a subplot to all of this that has emerged is there is a petition in Canada calling for Elon Musk's Canadian citizenship to be revoked. That has almost 400,000 signatures. I think now it is the most signed petition in the history of Canada. The previous was a petition calling for Justin Trudeau to resign, which happened. We will see if this one works as well, although, as we will get into, it is unlikely. We are joined today once again on the podcast, I think his third appearance, the man who wrote the book on citizenship, Amandeep Hire. I don't know if it's the book on citizenship or one of a few books, but he is our citizenship law guru. Amandeep, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
And just remember, Lisa also co-wrote the book, Lisa Middlemiss. So.
Right, Lisa Middlemiss and you co-wrote the book. But thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, no problem.
I think you and I also we just have an ongoing kind of political chat. So I thought that you would be a great guest because this combines both law and politics. So maybe I will just start by reading the petition, and then we can get into whether it is actually legally possible to revoke someone's citizenship for whatever it is that Elon Musk is doing, which we can get into, and how citizenship revocation actually works in Canada. We did an episode on this, almost a decade ago, where we discussed Mariam Monsef's whether or not her citizenship could be revoked. She was a former Liberal cabinet minister where there were allegations that in her initial refugee documents, when she and her parents came to Canada, there may have been inaccuracies. That was over a decade ago, so it will be good to revisit this. Any starter comments before we get into the petition?
No, let's go to the petition and we can talk about it.
Okay, so here is the petition. It is by NDP Member of Parliament Charlie Angus. From what I understand, just because he's presented the petition doesn't necessarily mean that he supports it. It just means that a certain number of his constituents presented this to him, and then the members of Parliament, from what I understand, have an obligation to present it. The petition states, whereas Elon Musk has engaged in activities that go against the national interest of Canada, he has used his wealth and power to influence our elections. He has now become a member of a foreign government that is attempting to erase Canadian sovereignty, and the attempts of Elon Musk to attack Canadian sovereignty must be addressed. We, the undersigned citizens of Canada, call upon the Prime Minister to revoke Elon Musk's dual citizenship status and revoke his Canadian passport effective immediately. And as I mentioned, it has 376,504 signatures. So obviously quite a lot of Canadians at least support or expressing their dislike of Elon Musk. I don't know how many of them have actually thought through what they are requesting in the petition. Why don't we start, Amandeep, with the obvious question, is this possible?
No, at least not in my opinion. So my understanding is that Maya Musk, who is Elon's mother, is a Canadian citizen. She was born in Regina. And because she was born in Regina, his Canadian citizenship comes under Section 3(1)(b), I believe, of the Citizenship Act. Just let me confirm when he was born. No, he's a little bit before that, so maybe 3(1)(g) is probably where he qualifies. And because of that, he's a Canadian citizen since birth, like me, you, Deanna. We're all Canadians since birth. In fact, this reminds me actually of a case which goes back a little bit further. In 2014, the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act came into effect, and one of the things it did was anyone who's a terrorist could have their citizenship revoked. And this, I believe it's the federal court that can struck that down, saying that did violate parts of the charter. So he does have a charter right to his Canadian citizenship once it vests. And under Section 10 of the Citizenship Act, the only way citizenship can be revoked is if somebody committed fraud, misrepresentation, or knowingly held information on an immigration or citizenship application. And none of that really applies here. He's a citizen by right of his lineage.
And so just to be clear, when you're saying commits fraud, you mean in the context of a citizenship application, not just someone has a fraud conviction in Canada, they can lose their citizenship.
Yes, or an immigration application. And none of those really apply here. He got his citizenship through very legitimate means.
So that's kind of it, eh? End of episode.
Pretty much.
But where I think it gets interesting is to discuss sort of the hypotheticals and what should the law be. It's obvious that under current Canadian citizenship legislation, someone cannot lose their citizenship because of the things mentioned in the petition, which actually aren't a crime per se. It's more activities that go against the national interest of Canada and using wealth to influence elections. Let's backstep a second. You mentioned that in 2014, the federal court had to look into the whole issue of whether someone could lose their citizenship for terrorism. This was under Bill C-24, Harper government legislation, the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act, as you noted, it was called. And I'm going to pull open the sections that are relevant here regarding this legislation. So the bill that Stephen Harper introduced, that was law, briefly anyways, provided that a Canadian citizen, and it's not only that they were a dual national, it was as long as it didn't render them stateless, which raised its whole other issues as to what renders someone stateless versus being a dual national. But under Harper's laws, which the Liberals repealed, a person could lose their Canadian citizenship if they were convicted of numerous types of convictions relating to national security. This included treason, terrorism, as you noted, and then a bunch of specific provisions and offenses under the National Defense Act and the Security of Information Act. Both of you, I believe, were practicing at the time. And what were your thoughts, before we get into some specific hypotheticals, sort of about how this went down? Maybe Amandeep, you can go into the history as well a bit more.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was actually articling at the time. I maybe hadn't finished law school. So what I remember correctly was this was really based off of the equivalent British law. So in Britain, they were revoking citizenship of anybody who had joined ISIS. And the Canadian government tried to sort of bring that into their own citizenship law through these statutes. And the idea was that if you had committed an act of terrorism, you could have your citizenship revoked. There had been a number of cases recently which sort of were very much highlighted in the public. In particular, I think it was Omar Khadr's case came up. That in particular was had sort of got the ball rolling on this. Now the issue is, the question here now becomes this: is this a power we really want to give to the state? At what point are we revoking citizenship? Loss of citizenship, in this case was, well, okay, the person maybe posed a security threat to Canada, had sort of taken up arms against Canada. That's one thing. And I think I'm not an Elon Musk fan, but do we really also want to start revoking citizenship for political beliefs? One thing that I always have to remind, particularly people who share my political beliefs, is we're not going to be in power forever. And the day's going to come when the other side's in power. Do you want to start setting precedents like this?
Yeah, that's always the argument that kind of gets raised in situations like this. It was this legislation, the Harper era legislation, which gave rise to the notion, or that phrase, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. That was sort of the mantra in the 2015 election. And as with many sentiment changes in the last decade, I think that sentiment may be fading. Again, it's hard to know with the 400,000 odd people who signed this, whether they're just expressing their dislike of Elon Musk or if they actually do want the government to have the ability to strip people's citizenship for what you describe as political beliefs. Some might say grave threats to Canadian national security. Deanna, what are your thoughts? Is this
Yeah.
something that we want?
Yeah, I agree with you that it seems to be more an expression of discontent as opposed to something that should be read, in my view, as a national request to have citizenship be something that's temporary. I do think that that is a real slippery slope, because as you said, Amandeep, I think when it starts becoming that citizenship itself is not permanent, I think it really does take away from the whole idea of citizenry. What does it mean? At what point does any kind of activity become homegrown? It's sort of like Canada's abdicating its responsibility for its own citizens. And I think that that's not responsible either. So I think that citizen is a citizen, much as I would like. I am also not a fan of Elon Musk, but I think that I don't think we want to go tinkering with the permanence of citizenship and the fact that it should be retained unless it has been acquired by fraud.
And we can't just ignore the secondary citizenship issue that's happening at the same time, which is the decision, and I'm going to butcher the name as I have been for the past year, but the Bajorquist case. And I shared a copy of the Citizenship Act in 1952 here. I don't know if I can present it, or Steve, if you can. Down here.
I'll be able to, yeah.
Yeah. So back in the 52 Act, it was very easy to lose your citizenship. In fact, these were all the reasons. One of which was actually if you go to war with Canada, but you could also lose it for leaving the country for 6 years. You can lose it because you're a dual national. You could lose it if you served in the armed forces of another country. If we go to the next page, it will also say, the governor had and council had significant powers to revoke. And this led to the problem which we know today as lost Canadians, where you have millions of people who are otherwise quite tied to Canada losing their citizenship because it was very easy to lose, and that caused problems. Mm. And if this is the bigger picture, if we start sort of creating pathways to lose citizenship, you're going to catch innocent people. You're going to catch innocent people who should not be harmed by it, and eventually, yeah, you can have millions of people coming, knocking at your door saying, hey, I'm not Canadian. Why? Yeah. And that's what happened.
I think 20 years from now, they'll be giving them back the citizenship.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen such an attrition of procedural fairness in proceedings before the court, before the boards, caused in a large sense by just volume, delay, all of that sort of thing as well. So just being able to administer this in a way that is fair, that's based on clear principles, I really hesitate. But I'm curious, if you go back to the wording of both the bill and of the Citizenship Act as it reads today, it does say that the ability that if there has been a false representation in an application for citizenship, or even to retain or resume citizenship. I'm curious about those other verbs in that, what that would mean. In what situations could revocation be used where you're resuming citizenship or where you're just, it makes me wonder, because I mean, in a situation where somebody has a birthright citizenship like Elon Musk, there wouldn't have been representations made at all. That was just by being born. But I'm just trying to figure out what the meaning of those other words might be.
Yeah. So I mean, that was sort of a situation where somebody acquires citizenship through fraud. So a really good example would be, let's say hypothetically, somebody said, yeah, my parent was born in Canada. Here's this birth certificate I got from the province of Nova Scotia. Give me Canadian citizenship, and they're deemed to be Canadian citizens since birth. Well, that might be an example where we take it away. Or the person hid half their travel history, or some criminal offenses they committed in another country, which prevented them from applying for citizenship through naturalization, or as we officially use it, the grant of citizenship.
Maria
Those are the
Moses'
types of
example
situations.
was, I think it was either whether her name was accurately disclosed or her place and date of birth.
Right.
And then, I mean, the big one, like, and our firm, as it did a lot of Vancouver firms, represented individuals during the whole New Can fiasco when people had false stamps in their passport.
For sure.
Or
That
they had
one's
false
clear.
employment in their citizenship application, which, even though it wasn't really material to a citizenship application where someone worked, years later, the government was going after people to revoke their citizenship.
Right. Yeah, those were clear grant applications where the false representations were made. It was just those other ones that I was a bit curious what they were trying to go for.
One question that I remember arising during Bill C-24, and I'm curious to hear your take on it, is someone can lose their citizenship for misstating something material in the citizenship application, and they cannot for being convicted of terrorism abroad. And the Harper government kind of presented it as, isn't the latter worse? So why should it be that misrep results in loss of citizenship while terrorism doesn't?
Well, the key thing there was terrorism abroad. Now, yeah, I trust the courts of Canada to make fairly fair decisions. I might trust the courts of Australia or Japan to do the same. Ask yourself this: do you trust the courts of other countries? Do you trust the courts of Saudi Arabia or Iraq or
Russia was the example given, I remember at the time, where would Russia convict a Greenpeace person for terrorism?
Or even now, like, I mean, before you talk politics, the United States, we're hearing, like right now, it seems like the courts are pushing back, but will they forever?
Right.
No, it's a good question. And even the position governments take here, like my general position is similar to yours, Amandeep, which is to start from the principle of would I want my political opponents to have this power? And for much of, God, the years all become a blur, 2023 and 2024, when the Mason case was going on and the Canadian government was trying to revoke people's permanent residency on security grounds for dismissed assault charges, I just have, ever since that kind of like piqued my sort of mistrust of giving the state authorities like this. And even in this petition, where there isn't actually an offense that they have alleged, that the petition alleges that Elon Musk has continued. He's just a member of a foreign government that is attempting to erase Canadian sovereignty.
Yeah.
You could extend this to Ted Cruz, who's a dual citizen. I can't remember who the other dual citizen in the U.S. Senate is.
John Toon.
John Toon. Once the door opens,
right. Anybody that we don't like. Yeah. I mean, I think the other rationale that I would say is that with misrepresentation, the rationale is that but for that misrepresentation, it's possible that person would never have acquired that citizenship. And so it's backward looking, whereas terrorism is something that they've done after having acquired that citizenship. So you can't retroactively take away that status that predated the conviction. So there's a kind of that is intuitive to me in some sense, that it's a status that was conferred that never should have been conferred, and that's what they're trying to reverse with those revocations based on misrepresentation.
And it's a very emotive argument too. I mean, what they were trying to do, they're saying, well, terrorism's so bad. Well, what about pedophilia? What about murder? What about...
Right.
I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah.
And at which point are we going to say, well, what about these other offenses? Mm-hmm. Or are we going to say, you know what, citizenship is just one of the things which is sacrosanct.
Right.
Your right to be in the country. The only way we should take it away is if you acquired it illegitimately.
Yeah. This is kind of what we've talked about too, like at what point does the person become ours? And that that once they are truly our person, that the whatever occurs is that doesn't go to the root of whether or not they're entitled to remain in this country.
Yeah, I don't know. I struggle with that. Like, to what extent is Elon Musk ours? What does Canada owe the world's richest man who doesn't live here?
Yeah, I struggle with that ideologically, but I think that goes more to the notion of birthright citizenship as opposed to whether or not once somebody has been made a citizen, we should give discretion to just take that away without any very clear basis as to why we're doing so.
Would you distinguish there then between birthright citizens and, like, if Elon Musk had obtained citizenship through a grant? Is that
no?
different?
Just one thing, we should be a little bit more clear. It's possible he did at some point acquire it through a grant, but because they came from a female lineage, retroactively they have deemed it to be a citizen since birth.
Right.
That's just one thing to just we should probably keep in mind. I mean, I guess it is. I mean, that's just. I mean, at the end of the day, what we've said is somebody who acquires citizenship through birth is different than somebody who immigrates to the country. We made that distinction. Now, of course, one of the risks we run is, I mean, I don't know about you, but I know most people, you fill out forms, at one point in time, you can make a mistake.
Yeah.
To what extent should that misrepresentation apply? So you were talking about the jobs that didn't exist. They're not material. But that's what you're going to go argue in front of the court, that, by the way, my mistake was not material when I checked the wrong box.
Yeah, and there now is there's a humanitarian and compassionate factors are sort of built into the assessment, which we could do a whole other podcast episode about when they are and when they aren't. And I find it problematic whenever they aren't, just because I feel like they should always be considered.
Yeah, agreed.
I mean, building on that, I mean, there's other things. I mean, if people are upset, see, look at the honors he's received. Maybe that's the one, or the contracts he's received.
Well, or, I mean, right now it seems like, I mean, it's just a very interesting time because there's his, the different Canadian cities are removing U.S. flags. Teslas seem to be like a target. It's passions are very inflamed, and this petition is one of them. Do you think this petition does lead to any type of change in the law, or does the government not go anywhere near this and sort of maintains the Canadian is a Canadian mantra?
I'm hope cooler heads prevail on this one, because if you start opening up this can of worms, you can open up another can of worms. And if you start doing that, then it's the next thing, then the third thing, then the fourth thing. At what point does that stop?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I don't think it's going to have any impact. I don't think that Elon Musk, while he would have the option to renunciate his own Canadian citizenship, I don't think he has any inclination to do so. That would be the only potential uptick to this petition. But again, what we're hearing so far is he considers it basically a tangentially American in the first place. So why would he bother? But I think that it just stands as a showpiece for Canada's frustration for what is going on, and really nothing more than that.
I mean, there's one hypothetical. I mean, it's also a constitutional issue too. Like, can we just start revoking citizenship? I'm not sure. I'll look at Section 33 again. I'm pretty sure citizenship is one of the ones which is exempted from the
notwithstanding clause.
Yeah, I think it's one of the ones which you cannot use an notwithstanding clause on. I'll double check that. I don't know if all you guys know this notwithstanding clause. The bigger question, which we probably will have to address, though, is if maybe we can say one day, like, if you're a citizen of a hostile country, you have to pick between one or the other. That might be seen as constitutional. Like, you decide, do you want to be Canadian or do you want to be Russian?
that was sort of one of the issues that emerged with the Bill C-24 under Harper, was that publicly they kept referring to it as dual nationals, which implies some sort of a choice. Whereas the legislation itself talked about unless you were otherwise stateless. And that raised all sorts of issues. The big one actually was for Jewish people, and whether, because they could theoretically go to Israel, they could never purely be stateless. And there were all sorts of submissions, hypotheticals. And I think one case involving whether Bill C-24 would have rendered any person who could go to Israel and become a citizen subject to the law that if they did commit or get convicted of a serious offense, they could lose their citizenship. Let's switch gears for a little bit and get into some other issues in Canadian citizenship law now. Amandeep, when you were on last, the federal court had granted, or the Ontario Superior Court of Justice had granted an extension on the changes that it had demanded, or the striking down of Canada's citizenship by descent law. Do you want to just give an update on both what the court said and where we are now?
Sure. We're back where we started. We had another extension for 1 month this time. The government asked for a 12-month extension. There was a bill, it was Bill C-71, which I think ironically had very broad-based support. In fact, I think all 4 parties in the House supported it. The only issue was everybody wanted an election except the government. Things have changed. So the bill never passed. And it died on the order paper when Mr. Trudeau resigned and prorogued Parliament. So at the moment, there is no law, but it is a live issue. And I mean, the court tried to address a very narrow exception, but this is something which I think at some point as Canadians, we have to deal with. One of the things which always, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around it is, before February 15th, 1977, women did not have equal access to Canadian citizenship. Your citizenship was determined by the patriarch of your family. If you married a foreign national, you could lose your citizenship just because he was a foreign national. And I say he because back then that was the only way you could get married. Mm-hmm. We already mentioned that Elon Musk's mother was Canadian. It's likely she was not able to pass on her citizenship when he was born in 1971. It was likely later in time that he was able to get it retroactively. This is still a live issue, which is sort of ticking around in the background because the descendants of those individuals still don't have access to Canadian citizenship they were born beyond the first generation. And at some point, one of them is going to bring it up and say, well, the only reason I'm denied Canadian citizenship is because I happen to come from maternal lineage. And there are several reasons why that could happen. So at some point, I think Parliament's just going to have to go back and say, look, we got to rewrite this act. And say, it's time, we need to start again. And say, start from the point of view that both genders are equal.
I have no idea how they would go back and capture. I feel like they keep trying to do, plug it here, plug a hole here, and new holes are just constantly found.
The easiest way would be what the Americans did. They said, this is the date. This is when our act became gender neutral. Anyone born before this date is an American citizen if they had an American parent, and that's it. And we're just going to, moving forward, we'll apply a new law moving forward.
So Mark Miller has said that people can apply in the interim while the government kind of figures out, I guess there's going to be an election, so they're going to need another extension, but that there will be the option to apply for discretionary grants with priority given to those whose parents spent 1 year or more in Canada. And just to step back, for those who don't know the broad issue, in 2009, the Harper government ended the ability of Canadians to permanently pass down their citizenship to their descendants wherever they live. And there is 1 generation now. There's a 1 generation limit on that. The Ontario Superior Court of Justice, interestingly, not the federal court, but the Ontario Superior Court of Justice struck that down and gave the government kind of this extending period to fix it. So there's right now struck down legislation that has been suspended, and IRCC in the interim is saying that people who would otherwise be citizens can now apply for discretionary grants with no clear criteria. What are you guys seeing in terms of these applications?
I'm taking a very cautious approach on these applications. If they clearly fit into one of the exceptions, so either urgency, or there's a new one now, which is retroactive loss under what was formerly Section 8, which is a separate issue, I'm applying. If there is an urgency, I'm telling them to wait. It just don't push the envelope on this one. We don't know what the final version of the act will look like. But again, although considering all four parties came on and said, yeah, the retroactive issue, we just have to pretend like it doesn't exist and start all over, I think it will eventually just look the same, which is we're going to set a date. Before this date, everyone is Canadian and all their descendants are Canadians until the bill passes.
You don't think they're going to go with the 1 year in Canada?
No, because the first thing I'm going to say is, well, here's this example of a male descendant of a male, and the exact same facts on the female side, but the female is disqualified. Now you have a Section 15 issue again, and we're back at it. And in fact, I mean, the courts and Parliament playing this game of ping pong going back to about 97 when this issue was first identified by the Supreme Court in Benner in Canada. At some point, Parliament just has to say, well, we screwed up back then. We had values that we don't hold anymore.
So on the IRCC website right now, it says that for those who are considering, am I a Canadian citizen, I guess, who can get a certificate, it says that the following people qualify for getting a Canadian citizenship urgently, where they need to avoid situations of harm due to race, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, to move a child to Canada if they were born outside of Canada and have a Canadian parent, if they're stateless, if there's a death in the family and they need to travel urgently, to apply for a job or to avoid losing a job, to attend school, college, or university, and to access benefits like pension or healthcare. And from what I understand, the government is being very liberal in interpreting these requirements and is granting citizenship to people who, before this decision to strike down the limitation on citizenship by descent, wouldn't have gotten citizenship. So we're in a bit of an odd period right now where there is no law. There may be a stricter law that comes down or a broad law, as Amandeep either thinks will come or hopes will come. But right now, people are applying and getting citizenship.
And that's also going to be an issue too. Eventually somebody's going to say, well, why don't I get it now? The government's already set this precedent. Especially, like I said, I mean, it's just so baked in the Citizenship Act. The denial of citizenship by gender is so heavily baked in. At some point, if it's not going to be this round of reforms, it will be a future round of reforms where we have to look at it and say, we have no choice.
When you were last on, you mentioned that, I can't remember the number, there may be a large number of people outside of Canada who may be Canadian citizens. Has that number changed, and what was the number?
I think it was about 20% of the population of New England is what I said it would be.
20% of the population of New England.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know the population of New England off the top of their head, what is that about?
I don't know. I think it's about 40 million. So
no, that's 40 million in New England. Oh, because, yeah, of course, that's several states.
Yeah, let me just take a look. Wikipedia is always good
Not
for something.
The Patriots, New England, the geographic region, not the football team.
Yes. Although I think some of the Patriots would probably qualify too. Here, New England population is... Oh, no, I'm wrong. It's 15 million.
15. So anyway, there could be millions abroad. For those wondering kind of where the origin of, like, why did the Conservative government impose the limitation on citizenship by descent, it was during the 2006 Israel-Lebanon conflict where Canada had to evacuate thousands of Canadian citizens who were living abroad and who didn't seem to have ties to Canada. So that's where the concern by the Harper government arose. I think they're going to try to, I don't think they're, we'll see. I mean, I'm curious, we can put our bets down. I think the final approach that they take is going to be the 1 year requirement that the parent has to have had, because I don't think they're going to want to go down this path of unlimited Canadians abroad who have no ties to Canada. Because that also goes to Deanna, what Deanna was saying at the start, which is, what does Canada owe those people?
Yeah, exactly. I think also when the Harper government introduced the restriction, they were very focused on the idea of, the making sure that there was some integrity or some quality in what having Canadian citizenship. So it's not just like you get a passport and you keep it in your drawer in case someday on a rainy day you want to come up and take a job, that they wanted it to have some value and some attachment, as opposed to just something that was available to you. And I think that does make some sense. That it's not just kind of the low-hanging fruit. I mean, I think it's serving a lot of purposes for people right now because, it's another avenue to look at when somebody doesn't qualify for permanent residency. But I'm just not certain that this is the right way of going about it. Well, you don't qualify for permanent residency, but there might be a direct pathway to citizenship.
But here's the issue, which will come up again, is what about all the men who have descendants born today and they're still qualifying? Because we made that little exception for those who already had citizenship before that date to the first generation limit. You have a bunch of men who are going to qualify, but none of the women's descendants.
For sure.
And that's the real issue. Like, I mean, I get the idea, like, we don't owe these people anything. We also don't owe the descendants of the males anything, but the law, the way it's written, it has deemed them citizens since birth, so they can't be taken away either.
Yeah.
You can't tell the female descendants, well, sorry, just because it was your grandma, not your grandfather.
Yeah. No, I agree with you that the disparity in treatment between male descendants and female descendants needs to be remedied in some clear way. And also, like, just the higgledy-piggledy nature of the Citizenship Act has been such a... Higgledy-piggledy, yeah. There's no other way to describe it. I mean, I don't tend to do citizenship applications because, to me, trying to navigate that act is just, it's a mind-bending exercise. It just shouldn't be that complicated. I remember at one point, Canada tried to create that Canadian citizenship wizard so that you could just answer questions from a pull-down menu and get an answer. Am I or am I not a citizen? And even the wizard was not capable of answering this simple question. Any rule that is so complicated that, an actual computer tool can't get you in 6 clicks to an answer, yes or no, am I a citizen? It's not appropriate. It's not a good tool. Like, it's not a
Grok, ChatGPT, you'll put in fact patterns and it'll just say nobody knows. Go see a lawyer.
Exactly. And then the lawyer is like, man, I don't know. Like, let's ask Amandeep and maybe
Let's conclude kind of on the practical point, which is, I'm sure, everybody gets these questions from clients, or maybe you're somebody in this scenario, and it goes along the line of, my grandmother may have been a citizen, my grandfather may have been a citizen. You can't find their higgledy-piggledy birth certificates, so I don't know what documents you have to prove this, but I'm pretty sure they were born up there. And we're not really sure where mom was born. No one's seen her for a while. How do you approach such applications or requests?
That's becoming the practical. So as much as we're talking about this, like, we have all this, so it's going to create 20% of the population of England. How are you going to prove it? That's the real question.
How do you prove
it? It's going to be hard. Now, if you come from, like, a descendant from one of the Western provinces, it's not that hard, actually. The Western provinces, from day one, when Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and BC were admitted to Confederation, the first thing they did is they created a vital statistics office. And they kept accurate records. So you can go to the government of British Columbia, the government of Alberta, government of Manitoba, or Saskatchewan, and say, can I get my grandparents' birth certificate? Here it is. No problem. Stop. What about the other ones, the more populated provinces back then? Alberta's population when it entered, I think, was a fraction of what it is today. It was a fraction of the country. BC's was a fraction of the country. Majority of the people lived Ontario East. Those provinces didn't create a centralized vital statistics office well into the 1900s. Mm. And most of them will say, if the person was born more than 100 years, go ask Ottawa. We don't even keep records of that. Mm. Okay, so we start there. Though we're not going to issue a new certificate. That might actually be the actual thing which blocks people from practically acquiring it. Right. And to put it really in perspective, Quebec, every birth certificate issued before 1997 was voided because that was finally when they created the Centralized Vital Statistics Office and the Director d'Etat. That's going to be
My mom was born in Quebec before 1977. Her birth certificate's void?
Yes. It was either issued by the church or the county or the city. So that might just be the actual bottleneck here.
Interesting.
Yeah. Wow. Yes, it reminds me of the days that I was with dealing with trying to trace blood transfusions and discovered that they were the records going back were like on little cue cards and shoeboxes stored in big warehouses, you know.
We had in the Lonely Canadian program where you have to prove that you have no living parent or grandparent that could be sponsored. We were representing someone who was in their late 60s or early 70s, and IRCC insisted that they needed to see the grandparents' death certificates. And I basically sent a picture of the Manila skyline after the Battle of Manila in World War II and went, it's somewhere in there. And they approved the application. But documentary requirements can often be a huge hurdle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So practically speaking, we're not talking about all of a sudden 20% of 15 million becoming Canadian. Yeah, they are in theory. In practicality, they're not getting a Canadian passport.
Yeah. Yeah. I think though that the other message to come out of all of this is just the degree of distress that Canadians are feeling about sort of autocrats gaining access to sensitive information, just the feeling that government powers are getting so extreme. This is the sort of thing that we're seeing coming at us. And I think it just speaks to the fact that Canadians are feeling very, very, intimidated and upset and feeling like, elbows up. And, I think if nothing else, the petition stands for all that.
And the other thing, just to keep in mind, is that we are a society which is heavily individualized, where we aren't used to this level of state power, but it was normal not that long ago.
You don't have a national ID card, right? That was one of the first things that really struck me when I started practicing Canadian immigration law. And especially people who come from countries where there are national ID cards are stunned that we don't have them. And from what I understand, that's part of this holdover of we are resistant to the federal government having all these powers. Until recently, we didn't track exits from Canada, right? It started from a very small liberal perspective that I do think is changing over time.
Yeah,
highlighted in part by this petition.
Yeah, but maybe that's exactly what this, if this were to come to pass, that the government had the power to revoke, it would actually be going exactly in the wrong direction of giving too much power to too few to be able to give and take those privileges and rights away.
And I mean, I know everybody's saying, the Trump government's going fully fascist. I haven't been fully convinced of that. I just point out, there's been non-fascist governments which have done some pretty horrible things too.
Yeah.
Our government, it wasn't that long ago. It was, if you think about it, my grandfather was still alive, but we grabbed every single Japanese Canadian, put them into concentration camps, and then shipped them back to Japan, including those born in the country.
Yeah. Yeah, we did an episode, where we discussed the internment of Japanese Canadians, not about 6 or 7 episodes ago. And I think that those kinds of reflections are really important right now because I personally this is for me a real low point in my career. I'm finding practicing immigration law right now to be very distressing. I'm finding the degree of dysfunction in all processes to be at an absolute high point. I feel like we're not really fighting what we're fighting. Like everything just feels like these really bizarre, ridiculous procedures. And I feel like, so I think that I understand the exercise of wanting to have a show of power about like, no, we don't like him, we want him out. But I think the idea of like having a system that makes sense, that abides the values and principles that we are agreed upon as a society, I think that we've really lost sight of that in a pretty epic way right now. Focus on those things at home.
And sometimes we need that reminder too. That's what this could be. This whole exercise is a reminder that pluralism, liberalism, the idea of individual rights is important.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's quite common that there's a tendency to be like, no, get rid of da-da-da. But that's really just a repetition of, the kind of like fascist leaning tendencies that.
Oh, I mean, you can see just, some guy with dark skin is at the art gallery saying that we need to end support for Israel, and people will start saying deport him. Like it's a very weird, and the guy person could be a citizen.
Yeah.
For those who are watching on Twitter, so we've started live streaming. For those who are doing audio only, we have started live streaming these episodes. And for those who are watching on Twitter, I don't know if it's possible to comment on Twitter. If it is, please let me know. But we just got our first YouTube comment in the history of our streaming, which is, I feel the same way, Deanna. In general, morale is extremely low. I wake up with anxiety before work every morning. That's from an immigration consultant.
Yeah, honestly, I'm having like a true existential crisis, and I feel like, I don't know if other practitioners are feeling the same way, but like I'm finding the practice of immigration law demoralizing. And I think I think that the idea of chipping away at good policy even further is the wrong direction. I feel like we need to go back to first principles and be like, what are we trying to accomplish here? And not eroding those things, but building them back up. Because I think we're a little lost.
And she just said, oh, wow, basically first comment, huge fan. So that's what we're hoping with this live stream, is to start making this a little bit more interactive.
Interactive, 100%.
Come on to YouTube and follow us there. And
please,
if there is a way to do comments on Twitter, do let me know, because I just don't know.
Yeah.
But on that, Amandeep, this has been fun. As I mentioned, Amandeep and I have just a phone thread, a WhatsApp thread, where we discuss politics. And obviously there may be an election coming up announced this week. So I'm sure we'll do some episodes around different policy proposals that are coming up. And hopefully we can have you back on in what looks like will be the near future.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Awesome.